begin.
Pronto. Começa novamente? Perfeito.
Start again.
Muito obrigado aí
Going back again. Thank you for your patience.
O IRI
Once
realiza
again, the IRI is holding an international event in our cycle of discussions on private investigation. And today we'll be talking about the importance of internal investigations for solving corporate crime cases. We'll have the participation at our event today of authorities from the Department of Justice in the US, and authorities from the Brazilian Public Prosecutor's Office, other public authorities in Brazil. First of all, Mr. Fritz Scanlon is a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice. He's been a trial lawyer at the Unit on Market Integrity and Major Frauds. He's been a public prosecutor since 2018, has a long history of working in corporate crime, especially in the area of health. Good morning, Dr. Scanlon. It's a pleasure to receive you here.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Muito bem. Eu também gostaria de apresentar.
Very well. I would also like to introduce another authority from the Department of Justice, Dr. Matthew Perry, who's also a federal prosecutor, the assistant chief of the Unit of Market Integrity and Major Frauds in the Department of Justice. He's been a federal prosecutor since 2014, has a long experience in corporate crime investigations, and also specific experience in using data to detect and try white-collar crimes. Dr. Avey, it's a pleasure to receive you here too. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Muito bem. Também é prazer
Fine. It's also a pleasure to have the participation of Antonio Carlos Begonia. And Carlos Begonia, we all know him. He's the under federal prosecutor in São Paulo. He is an authority in the field of the public prosecutor's office, working with traditional populations and indigenous peoples. We're very thankful for him being with us. Good morning. It's an honor to be with you at Erie once again at this important debate. I wish you all good work today. Thank you. And then finally, no less important, my friend and partner, Leandro Daiello, who has had a brilliant career in the federal police force. He spent a long time in that agency, and during the period when major operations of the federal police took place under the car wash operations and many others as well. Leandro will certainly share his experience in corporate crime investigations. Good morning, Leandro. Good morning, Valdir. It's a pleasure to see you all. We'll have a great morning today, I'm certain. Thank you. Straight from Porto Alegre, I believe.
Muito bem. Eu queria
Very well. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to, you can hear the interpretation in English and in Portuguese. We have simultaneous interpreting taking place, and from the get-go, we beg your pardon for any difficulties in our technical setup that may come up. But to begin, to warm up our discussion, I would like to make an initial provocation to Dr. Scanlon. Dr. Scanlon, this process of applying fines and penalties against companies, that's very mature in the US Department of Justice. That's been an inspiration for many other countries to also adopt systematic accountability of companies. Brazil is one example. We are gaining experience, and much inspiration comes from the US system in the areas of corporate fraud, in policing area, in the capital market field. I'd like to hear from you about to what extent do you think that investigations undertaken by companies themselves to identify people responsible for corporate crime, to what extent are they used and accepted by the Department of Justice in the US for companies, for example, to come to a leniency agreement? Or please go ahead.
All right, so for the benefit of Mr. Perry, the question is how are internal investigations used in connection with negotiations or discussions with the Department of Justice about corporate criminal resolutions? And the short answer is they can be very important. And really the way there are a number of ways they can be important, but two in particular I want to address are, the first is in a traditional situation where the Department of Justice comes to you, to a company, and is investigating corporate wrongdoing, and that is wrongdoing that is done on behalf of a corporation. The corporation can decide whether or not it wants to cooperate in that investigation, to actually affirmatively provide information to the Department of Justice about what happened. And so an internal investigation can be helpful in that respect, because an internal investigation can allow the corporation to go investigate and find out for itself the relevant facts of that misconduct and the relevant individuals who are involved. So the two things that are, and if that happens, if the Department of Justice is satisfied that the corporation has come forward and cooperated and conveyed these relevant facts about the misconduct and the individuals, that can then get credit for the corporation in the ultimate charging decision of the Department of Justice of how to resolve the case. It could be, a whole host of different types of resolutions. And another way that an internal investigation could potentially benefit a corporation when it is actually even before the Department of Justice gets involved. So, for example, you have a corporate compliance program, and that compliance program is functioning well, and it detects wrongdoing within the corporation itself before the Department of Justice knows. An internal investigation there, finding out what happened in a timely fashion, and then affirmatively, a choice, no requirement, but a choice to affirmatively come forward to the Department of Justice and provide full information about that wrongdoing. The voluntary self-disclosure can have really significant benefits for the company. And that is both just in any context, but in particular in the FCPA context. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has an official policy, the corporate enforcement policy, where affirmative self-disclosure, full cooperation, full remediation, full disgorgement in certain circumstances can actually result in a presumption of a declination by the Department of Justice, which would be, from a corporation's point of view, one of the best outcomes possible. And as I am describing all these things, I just want to make two quick points. And that is, one, Avi and I are here today to discuss official Department of Justice policy. We're not announcing anything new. And that official policy can really be found in something called the Justice Manual, which is available at www.justice.org. I really commend anyone who gets a knock on the door from the Department of Justice or thinks about knocking on the Department of Justice's door to really consult the Justice Manual. And the second point is that the decision to undertake an internal investigation or not is not a requirement. It's up to the company But if it is done, it can really inure to the benefit of the ultimate resolution of the investigation and potential prosecution of the company.
May I add a point?
I would like to add a point. Yeah.
First of all, I'm very grateful to be a part of this distinguished panel this morning. And I thank you for inviting me and my colleague, Mr. Scanlon, to participate today. To echo Mr. Scanlon's comments, there are three key decision points in the lifetime of a corporate criminal case brought by the Department of Justice. An internal investigation, a good, competent, reliable internal investigation, is important at each one of those 3 points. Point one is the decision by the department whether or not to bring a criminal case at all. Point two is what type of criminal case the department will bring, what form the resolution will take, whether the department will decline the case, whether the department will enter into a non-prosecution agreement, whether the department will enter into a deferred prosecution agreement in which charges are brought but deferred for a period of up to 3 years typically, or fourth, and most seriously, whether the department will insist on a guilty plea or a conviction. The third stage at which an internal investigation is important is if the department has already decided to bring a criminal case and it is not a declination, an internal investigation can be helpful in assessing what the penalty is. So corporate criminal cases, because we can't put corporations in prison, the penalty will be a financial one in most respects. An internal investigation and robust cooperation will bring the number down. That means that the company will pay significantly less in most cases. So to echo what Mr. Scanlon said, an internal investigation is helpful at stage one because if a company conducts a proficient, effective internal investigation and self-discloses to the department, meaning the company is the one who brings the criminal conduct to the department's attention. In some instances, that can result in no criminal case whatsoever. The department might exercise its discretion not to bring any type of criminal case. But that is the premise there. And this is really the crucial point I want to leave you with. It has to be a thorough, competent internal investigation. Whether you are using inside or outside counsel, it has to make a meaningful attempt and successfully uncover all relevant facts about substantial misconduct committed by actors within the company. There are circumstances in which a bad internal investigation, a second-rate internal investigation, is worse than no internal investigation whatsoever, because you will lose credibility with the Department of Justice, and worse, you could omit important facts, or the worst case scenario, you could inadvertently mislead the department. So at step one, it has to be. If you are undertaking an internal investigation, I would urge you to make it a robust, thorough one with competent, experienced counsel, and to hold nothing back, to be transparent, and to be forthcoming at all times. In a number of our past resolutions, we have credited companies who have conducted robust internal investigations for bringing to our attention bad facts for the company, adverse facts for the company. We regard that as a point in the company's favor. If a company is forthcoming and affirmatively flags for the department negative facts that will help the department's investigation, it's a bit counterintuitive, but that actually helps the company. So that's stage one. If there's an internal investigation and it is a serious, meaningful one, it can result in the department exercising its discretion not to bring a case whatsoever. At the second level, an internal investigation, as Mr. Scanlon was saying, can help the company accrue what is called cooperation credit. And that can mean the difference in form of resolution, whether it is a guilty plea or a deferred prosecution agreement or a non-prosecution agreement or a declination. Cooperation is one of the most important factors that the department considers in determining what form the resolution will take. And finally, an internal investigation is crucial because of the cooperation credit if there is to be a criminal resolution in helping the department determine what the financial penalty should be. You may have seen Mr. Scanlon alluded to the Justice Manual. There are factors that the department has to consider and does consider in assigning a financial penalty to be imposed, a fine. And cooperation credit in many instances can dramatically reduce the amount of the fine, in some instances to as much as 25% below the bottom of the range that otherwise would be applicable. So there are significant benefits to an internal investigation as part of cooperation at every stage of a corporate criminal case. But to echo Mr. Scanlon, it is not required. There are circumstances in which a company otherwise could receive a declination, could receive a low fine, even if it does not conduct an internal investigation. But the crucial point, just to reiterate it one more time, that I want to leave you with is, if the company conducts an internal investigation, it can be very helpful, but it must be a good internal investigation. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Perry.
And thank you, Dr. Perry and Dr. Scanlon.
De passar agora para o
I'd like to now turn it over to Mr. Begonha to talk about Brazil's experience.
nessa questão.
And
Nós
the
sabemos
public prosecutors in Brazil on this issue. Obviously, companies that do an internal investigation to detect responsibility, the authors for corporate crime, whatever it is, they intend to collaborate with the authorities, and they do this precisely to have remediation measures taken, correct their own control systems, to pay back losses to third parties if that is the case, and also a recommendation to share that information with the authorities, public authorities, that will prosecute them and levy fines, even if they're lower fines. In Brazil, different from the US, some crimes, some offenses in the
considerados crimes, não estão
stock market, for example, are not typified as crimes per se. There are situations where a company may be sanctioned or penalized, but there will not be sanctions for the physical persons. We do not have the obligation of an internal control system, except in a few sectors of companies. The compliance systems are not compulsory for most sectors of the economy. So there's no application of sanctions for lack of compliance measures. But Brazil is evolving in celebrating agreements and coming to settlements, trying to make compatible or to stimulate companies to make voluntary denunciation and self-disclosure, in whether this involves competition crimes in the CADE, in anti-corruption with public contracts with the comptroller's office, and in the capital markets, in the financial system, where with administrative agreements and supervision approved by Brazilian law. Now, Dr. Begonha, how does our Brazilian public ministry, we call it, the public prosecutor's office, how do they deal with the credibility of internal investigations to be used to be able to prosecute physical persons or come to settlements and negotiate agreements with the companies or persons? Thank you for the question, Walter, and I want to greet all the U.S. prosecutors who came before me, Dr. Avi and John. From what I see, they have long experience in this field.
O Bigonha congelou a sua.
His sound got
No senhor,
uh,
não está acontecendo?
okay. Now we can hear him. He got cut off a little bit. When you introduced me, you said that I am an expert in corporate crime. Actually, I historically worked more in the civil area in collective rights and also was active in administrative malpractice, but I'm not an expert in criminal areas and I never dealt institutionally with these cases. But last year, actually in 2019, I had a seat on the Supreme Court working with Raquel Dodge, and I had experience working with money laundering in the context of the operations that were carried out by the Brazilian police and the prosecutor's office. So I had contact with these issues in 2019. Last year, I also sat on a commission made up by the president of the Chamber of Deputies, the Speaker of the House, in a debate on updating our laws on money laundering and fighting international crime. So when I was invited by the
Rafael Valim para participar.
Director Rafael Valim to be in this discussion today, I did a little study on corporate crime and internal investigations.
De interesse aqui para a nossa
And I
audiência.
think that's of interest to our audience here, which is not made up just of experts in the audience out there. So I would say that this issue that we're discussing this morning is very important in contemporary criminal law and even central to penal law in Brazil. In the prosecution systems in many countries, this has been the subject of heated debate worldwide.
Nós podemos afirmar, sem cometer o risco de cometer uma injustiça,
say
o incremento,
with all certainty that the growth of interest in actions against this type of corporate crime fits into the context of globalization that began in the 1980s, that put these issues on the table. And in the 21st century have become vital for consecrating this international financial community. So the actions of private companies in one country can have impacts on the world financial order. So everyone is looking at internal economies, domestic economies, and companies' behaviors because of the potential for impacts of misconduct by a private company domestically on the international community. The mechanisms of IT have given big capital a great chance to have impacts on domestic economies of many nations, and that those impacts can spread around the world instantaneously. Alongside that economic power of this global village, we have these challenges in terms of restricting and fighting sophisticated organized crime, which is active internationally and with instantaneous mobility worldwide. So that new virtual world brings out this discussion because we cannot just look at the political and physical borders of countries and states, because there's an interconnectivity amongst all the forms of capital, these illegal activities that are interconnected and located instantaneously everywhere at the same time. So how can we make compatible our criminal prosecution domestically for crimes with international impacts without interfering in local sovereignties of nations. So the initiative of this discussion
É importante
is
investigar
that it'll bring us closer to the importance of internal investigations in companies, which is the subject today,
da
the
investigação
importance of internal investigations of corporate crime, but how to make them compatible with sovereignties of states, classical concept of sovereignty. This, of course, is a concept that's raising perplexities and doubts given the complexities of our worldwide network of computers and the great volatility of capital. So the response to this question can only be opening up a pathway through international cooperation. Namely,
pelo menos na
in
última
the past decade has been the main tool, the most powerful tool to make compatible or allow these investigations to be carried out domestically and internally in the companies, and also made available internationally without interfering in local sovereignties. So going back then to your question, as I see it, it's very important for domestic crime to be investigated and be investigated with due respect for fundamental rights guaranteed by our Constitution, and that those fundamental rights be interpreted through international cooperation, always preserved by the domestic courts. In our system, in the Brazilian legal system, the courts are the guardians of fundamental rights of individuals. So I see no contradiction in principle between international cooperation and national sovereignty, local sovereignty. On the contrary, I see this expedient international cooperation as being the affirmation of sovereignty, as long as it's carried out within the limits of fundamental rights. And we're all aware in Brazil, it's up to the courts to ensure. Those are my initial thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Begonha. And it is very important when we talk about cooperation in this discussion here with the presence of authorities from the U.S. Department of Justice, for us to understand how this works in practice. And I'll leave for the next round of questions for Drs. Scanlon and Perry, precisely this issue that you raised. For us to be able to understand it in a scenario where U.S. laws, especially the FCPA, have been expanding their jurisdiction and bringing in the accountability of companies in a very broad manner, including conducts that under Brazil's laws would not be classified as crimes with the application of penalties on physical persons, but in the US they would. So what the thing is we're seeing here in the Brazilian capital market, for example, we are evolving in our laws, but we're still not we still do not hold people accountable for as many crimes as the US does. So I want to leave this this question in the air for comments by Dr. Scanlon and Perry. But first of all, I'd like to check with Dr. Leandro D'Aiello, who's an expert in police investigation, and now as a lawyer, he has been active in this area of internal investigations. Dr. D'Aiello, we can see, we have seen the evolution, the gain in muscle power and techniques for investigation by the federal police, which you headed for many years. During that time,
Agora,
when many important investigations took place. Now, making a comparison with domestic investigation, internal investigations, especially with those requirements that Dr. Perry mentioned to make sure that those investigations are seen as serious, robust, carried out by people with well-experienced counsel, that they be complete and broad-ranging. How do you see that in the private sector in Brazil? Are we gaining in quality in investigations here? To what extent do the techniques that you implemented in the federal police, are they being used here by companies, by corporations? Good morning, Dr. Valdir. You're always very polite.
Tentando mais ou menos responder o que foi.
Before I came in, I did a little homework, and Begonia was very good when he talked about the evolution. The world is smaller today. The companies and money are moving around digitally very easily. And Brazil is almost all digital now. We're no longer in the stage that Valdir mentioned, when you take money into Paraguay over the bridge in an armored car. It's all online now. And the federal police has adapted, together with the public prosecutors, to the new times, developing investigation techniques, as far as I can recall, that are very close to what are done worldwide, of course, under and in accordance with Brazilian law. When we look at private investigations in Brazil, we have looked at 5 very good investigations. We find quality, but in the means of investigation that Brazilian legislation allows the private sector to do, we still do not use some certain tools for investigation. We also perceive that the market that we have been monitoring has increased, has expanded. The companies are perceiving the importance, not just of having investigations of their own on facts that they have found through their compliance structures, but the importance also of knowing, of having intelligence, of being able to know what's happening internally. So we've got a barrier. Valdir was good when he said that Brazil is going through the first, getting past the first barrier to achieving this, which is having compliance programs. So once you do have some information and risk analysis, I see more and more that Brazilian companies are trying to do internal investigations to have real knowledge of the breadth of what has happened. And second, to mitigate risks to themselves. If private companies face the natural risks of their competitors in the market, the movements, changes in the exchange rates and everything, they also have the risk that they run in terms of their credibility and reputations. I see no way to confront those risks without very robust internal investigations. Dr. Perry, I believe, talked about credibility of the investigations. That's very important. The care in investigation, in their procedures, their breadth, their capacity to cover many areas of knowledge, and the difference in the private and public sector. And the private sector has a lot of information. In the public sector, we have to run after the information. We have to go hunting for it. Of course, we have some investigative tools in the public sector. The private sector does not, but the breadth of the universe of information in the private sector is something where we're talking about an independent lawyer's office, independent from the company that's doing this work, and always trying to obey the laws when we do this. That's what gives credibility to investigations. And in Brazil, we're starting to perceive
perceber que é importante ter investigação,
that
é
it's
importante
important to have investigations, to have documents, to have that information to make decisions. And then, Valdir, I would go back to some of your questions. Investigation done in Brazil, could it be used in the procedures in the US? Since we're studying US law and the guarantees there in the US procedural law, legal procedures, and the points of credibility, which Dr. Perry ranged and as was said, as both Perry and Scanlon mentioned. So could Brazilian internal investigations be used in US criminal prosecutions? Now, going back to those 2 points, the first one raised by Dr. Begonia on international cooperation. Is it happening? Brazilian agencies that are responsible for regulating the capital market, the financial system, the CVM, the Brazilian SEC, the CGU, Agencies Against Corruption, or the CADE, which protects competition in Brazil. Have they been cooperating? Is there fluid, practical cooperation coming from Brazil? Are companies aware that possible crimes that are investigated, that are found or discovered in Brazil that have impacts, that they be captured by US jurisdiction, that they will be communicated to the DOJ, to the SEC, and also what Leandro said. In this situation, an investigation done by Brazilian offices in the private sector, would they be accepted by the US Department of Justice, Dr. Perry, Dr. Scanlon?
So the question, Avi, is will investigations, I'm sorry, I'd just like to clarify for a second, investigations conducted by who would be accepted by the Department of Justice? I think there was just an issue with the translation. Hello?
Dr. Valdir?
Sim,
Dr. Valdir?
I can hear everyone, but I don't hear the interpreter.
I'm back here. I was on the other channel into Portuguese.
Okay, I'm sorry. And what was the question? The question was what investigations conducted by who would be accepted by the Department of Justice?
A pergunta é que
The question is that in the cooperation, international cooperation, Brazilian agencies responsible for investigation and applying penalties for the practice of corporate crimes, have they taken that information to US authorities? And the other way around, does it happen? US investigations carried out by the US Department of Justice, are they shared with Brazilian public authorities? That's the first question. Investigations by public authorities on both sides. Second question, when you have an investigation carried out in Brazil by Brazilian private Brazilian lawyers' offices, are they accepted for collaboration with the Department of Justice?
So the question is, when an investigation is conducted by a public authority in Brazil, is it accepted by the Department of Justice? And then a second question is, when an investigation is conducted by a private authority, is it accepted by the Department of Justice? And so I would sort of, the first question is one that kind of, in my opinion, goes a little bit beyond the scope of of internal investigations. So I don't mean to completely sidestep the question, but the United States, of course, works with international authorities all over the world. And that's, that is a fact of life. And whether, except that's, the Department of Justice is always going to conduct its own investigation. And so that's a little bit to the side. So that's, does the United States cooperate internationally with international public bodies? Of course. But with regard to internal investigations conducted by a private authority, for example, a law firm in Brazil, it's the word "except" is an interesting one, because an internal investigation, and then let's just assume the company is cooperating. So it's providing the relevant facts about the investigation that this private authority has turned up. Now, the United States, the Department of Justice will, of course, use these facts and has its ears open. But at the same time, the Department of Justice is going to conduct, the US Department of Justice, we will conduct, like if you come to me, to Avi, we will conduct our own investigation. And we will need to verify everything that we're told. And that's why Mr. Perry's point about being a robust internal investigation is absolutely critical, because, there may have been a time in the past where the Department of Justice was willing to rely a little more on private corporate investigations in their fact-finding process. But now there's really a strong, push for independent investigation by the Department of Justice that's aided by the internal investigation. So an internal investigation that isn't robust can really backfire, because then there's the question not only of credibility, but if there's, in the worst case scenario, an omission of a critical fact, then all of a sudden the United States authorities are thinking, is this actually obstructing our investigation? And that can lead to some serious problems. So I would not think of it in terms of accept. It's more of in terms of cooperation. And then over time, there can be established, of course, mutual trusts. But as far as Mr. Perry and I, we will always conduct our own investigation into the facts learned to, trust but verify. So, Avi, do you have something you want to add to that?
No, I think that was perfectly said. As to the first part, the Department of Justice has profound respect for our counterparts in prosecutors' offices in Brazil. We've enjoyed great cooperation with local authorities in Brazil, especially in FCPA cases in the past. We look forward to working together in future cases. As to reports and results of private internal investigations, Mr. Scanlon is exactly right. The Department of Justice, Mr. Scanlon and I and others, our colleagues, are not simply paid to accept reports and say, we're done here, thank you so much for the results of your investigation, no further questions. It doesn't work that way. We do our own investigation. We conduct our own interviews. We review our own documents. We do our own data analysis. And that is the way that we can ensure that we have looked behind every corner and that we have discharged our duties to the United States. Internal investigations can be tremendously helpful in pointing us in the right direction or drawing our attention to facts that otherwise would be difficult for us to discover, or potentially making available to us employees and agents of the company who otherwise would be difficult for us to interview. In other words, providing access to people who are beyond our subpoena power because they do not reside in the United States. But, and this is a crucial point, we do not simply rely on the results of a company's internal investigation, and it would be, and I think you can expect to see that trend continue into the future.
Obrigado, Dr. Perry. Dr. Bigonha,
Thank
Nessa
you,
questão,
Dr. Perry. Now, Dr. Begonha, on this issue of international cooperation, we can see that we have made a lot of progress.
há uma troca de
There
informações
There has been a lot of exchange of information through the formal institutional channels.
Que balanço o senhor faz dessa evolução recente?
What is your evaluation of our recent evolution? How do you see trends into the future, considering this issue of integration and globalization that you mentioned in your first comments?
Já temos a participação do Brasil em
We
fóruns
have Brazil participating already in international fora. Brazil has improved its own legislation. It has joined international conventions and taken on membership responsibilities in those conventions, not just to improve our own laws, but also to improve our institutions and their work. We've seen this happening in practice in recent years. How do you see that? Do you think this cooperation will get more intense, as Dr. Perry hopes? And to what extent
de boa fé,
does this good faith collaboration, to what extent is it becoming a trend in the
para a pessoa física,
processes of prosecution of physical persons and legal persons in administrative terms, and the possibility of having non-prosecution agreements?
A pergunta é para quem?
o senhor?
The question is for you. It is for me.
A conexão está muito ruim.
My connection is not that good. I couldn't tell. Sorry.
Nós temos, da qual eu participei no ano passado, na Câmara dos Deputados.
Last year I was in this committee in the House of Representatives in Brazil, headed by the Speaker of the House at the time, Rodrigo Maia, and we had discussions about money laundering, and we heard from all the organizations, public institutions involved in the Brazilian prosecution system and private as well. And we see that Brazil is up to the state of the art in terms of legislation, because the representatives of institutions and social organizations are very pleased with our legal framework. We've got a legal framework that's quite good for us to work on investigating these crimes internally, and we've got a decree 3810 from 2001 that establishes how that data should be shared in international cooperation. In terms of case law, we have a trend of the courts that are very favorable to international cooperation. A recent decision by the higher court of justice validating the data
Com base no decreto
based on
3.810,
decree 3810 on international cooperation, saying that that data can be used in Brazil,
pode ser
coming
utilizado
from the US, can be used by Brazilian courts as long as you have the right for defense.
otimismo.
assured.
Eu acho que o
So I'm optimistic. Brazilian legal framework is very good. Our case law accumulated is quite favorable to this kind of investigation and cooperation. And I would simply add a certain note of caution
não na celebração, no cumprimento desse acordo, né,
in implementing the cooperation agreements. We have to be careful to ensure national rights, to share our interests with US interests or any other country, with other countries. But in this case, with the Department of Justice, which has been accredited in our agreement for sharing our information. So in Brazil, that's the Ministry of Justice. That's at the center of regulating that sharing of information. So I would just raise that caution that this activity is so important for the US, for Brazil, and for other countries that they have to be carried out in regulated environments, settings. When I was working in the Supreme Court, I raised this point with several different justices on the importance of investigation, but that it must be regulated and carried out formally, like it is in the U.S. In people's imagination in Brazil, there's a confusion between international cooperation, task forces, and leniency agreements. So as if you could do anything and everything with the best intentions of fighting international crime, but that's not true. Domestically, and under our legal order, those three practices are different. International cooperation is not an international task force. We can have domestic task forces for the domestic institutions to operate, but international cooperation must always be carried out by the central authority in pursuant to the laws and regulations and our Constitution as they are interpreted by our central authority, which is the Ministry of Justice. In the recent past, there were some exaggerations that took place, and I think that if they took place, they were carried out in good faith. Members of the prosecution and the police or the courts, and such exaggerations were referred to by the general prosecutor of Brazil, Mr. Aras, when he was interviewed in the Senate, to avoid international cooperation being an informal practice. It must be documented, carried out by the competent channels. And so I'm very optimistic in the General Prosecutor's Office, the PGR. We are working very hard in this area, and the Secretariat on Cooperation is headed by Dr. Lindenborg of Chateaubriand, Denise, and doing very good work. Thank you, Dr. Begonia. This issue of investigation being carried out formally with respect for the rules, as one authority has said, within the 4 lines of the ballpark of the field, within the 4 lines of the field, we have to ensure that to be able to enforce decisions with legal certainty so that in the future the decisions by the courts not be questioned. Very well, we're almost at the end of our meeting time, but I'd like to deal with one more issue with our participants from the US, with a comment based on a comment by Dr. Laiello. I'd like to hear from Drs. Scanlon and Perry about the investigative capacity of the Department of Justice. I'm certain it's evolved in recent times, especially using technology. As Dr. Perry said, the voluntary self-disclosure is very important for collaboration,
Haja, por
even to
parte
the point of
da Justiça, a iniciativa de não processarem
DOJ declining prosecution as a hypothesis or as an option. But with the improvement of your capacity for investigation, that voluntary self-disclosure may no longer be
iniciativa
such an unusual initiative. At times, a company may take information to the DOJ that the DOJ is already aware of. So how does that work? The U.S. Department of Justice, what's the state of the art for its investigative capacity? Maybe you could give some examples. And might that make
voluntária pelas empresas.
new cooperation more difficulty that's brought in by a company when companies want to cooperate, that if you already are out in front of them? How does that help or hinder?
So the question is, with the increased investigative power of the Department of Justice in the United States, but I would also assume it's for any investigative agency in the world with digital access to data, how does that affect a company's decision to self-report, or what type of credit they can get for self-reporting if the DOJ already knows about it? And the question is, and a related question is sort of any examples of this. So I think we're not going to comment on any examples of it happening, or certainly not potentially happening, just not as contrary to DOJ policy. But I will say that, it's true the Department of Justice has powerful investigative techniques. And it is, of course, possible that the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, is already looking into a company or individuals associated with that company before anything is self-disclosed. But what I can tell you is that if a company does self-disclose, does affirmatively come forward before there's an imminent threat of investigation. So if the only reason that a corporation is coming forward is because they know the Department of Justice is about to bang down their door, the credit you get is clearly not as high. But when a company does self-disclose or does cooperate, as Mr. Perry and I have stated a number of times, that can, if done properly, really inure to the benefit of the company, whether the Department of Justice has started an investigation or not. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I don't think it causes any problems or should chill it. And in fact, even before that decision point of whether to self-disclose, one thing that really actually can have a significant effect on United States Department of Justice charging decisions is, how good is that compliance program that's sitting there that detects it internally before we or some other public authority comes to you? So there are internal investigations that hopefully will be kicked off because a robust internal compliance program will detect this wrongdoing, and then it will be pushed up to the right people for evaluation and then decision of whether to self-disclose or to cooperate if an investigation has been commenced. So I actually think that there shouldn't be any chilling effect based on increased investigative abilities or data analysis. That I think, in my opinion, that the benefit of if a company does decide to cooperate or self-disclose, the benefits will be there, whether we're investigating or not.
So to add a few words briefly, there are two benefits to self-disclosure. There's two reasons why we at the Department of Justice care about self-disclosure. And it's important to understand each one. One is we learn facts through self-disclosure, and we can investigate those facts and follow up on those facts. That's absolutely important. But the other reason, and this goes to your question, is a company that makes the decision to self-report, to self-disclose, we can trust that company more, right? We have to make a decision when we prosecute a corporation, the same as when we prosecute an individual. Is this a bad actor? Is this a company which is likely to get into trouble again? Or is this a company where there was a discrete period of misconduct, criminal misconduct, and we don't have to worry as much about another instance of misconduct? When a company self-discloses to us, that tells us something about the character of that company and about the likelihood of recidivism and about the culture, as Mr. Scanlon was saying, the culture of compliance as it exists at the company. What I mean is, if a company elects to make a disclosure to the Department of Justice. It gives us fidelity. It gives us confidence that the company, where it is today, is a company in which we can trust and has a lower likelihood of recidivism. So, self-disclosure is crucial for that reason, and it begins discussions with the Department of Justice on a better footing. As to the enhanced and increasingly the evolving capacity and investigative capabilities of the Department of Justice, rest assured that the Department of Justice and our law enforcement partners work diligently to prosecute crimes that have a substantial effect on the United States. But the fact that we, increasingly everyone lives in the cloud and we all, work with remote computing services, and that may enhance our investigative skills, that should make a company more willing to self-disclose, not less willing. In other words, the fact that we could and have increased capacity to discover criminal conduct on our own should make a company more willing, not more reluctant to self-disclose. Mm-hmm. So I would urge the audience, and I'm grateful for the participation today, I would urge the audience to take seriously and to seriously consider the possibility that it is in fact in a company's best interest and the best interest of the company's stakeholders or shareholders and other interested parties to conduct a robust, credible internal investigation and to make self-disclosures as appropriate to investigative and government authorities wherever they are. And I would also put in a plug. We at the Department of Justice are always happy to receive those reports, and we are always happy and committed to treating fairly companies that take seriously their internal investigations and take seriously their disclosure obligations and show a commitment to doing the right thing and to righting the ship going forward. So, very happy always to receive telephone calls and emails with self-reports, myself or Mr. Scanlon or our colleagues here at the Department of Justice, whether in the FCPA unit or in our unit, which focuses on other types of financial crimes and market integrity crimes. I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to talk to you all today, and grateful to our hosts, and look forward to continuing the dialogue with our counterparts, of course, in Brazil.
Doutor Dael.
Leandro, his sound is off. He's muted, actually. There it is. Now I'm on. He says, we have observed, volunteer, that the investigative capacity of agencies in Brazil has increased, moving from a university with limited measures and tools, and also the legislation has evolved significantly in the past decade to give us new tools and means for investigation. I always highlight Begonha's concern that he expressed. All these investigative tools and the capacity of prosecution
Tem que ser parametrizada.
agencies in Brazil, they are always guided by the law, by the guarantees of individual freedoms but within the rights. In terms of public investigation, the investigative agencies have significantly, very, very much increased their capacity in the digital university, because in the digital universe, because Brazil has a capacity for producing digital information. I see information coming from the federal the Revenue Service, the COAF investigation agency, and the Ministry of Finance. The police investigation brings out information. The Comptroller's Office of the federal government, the Federal Prosecutor's Office, the PGR, all allow the Brazilian state to be more capable of identifying points of risk where a more further investigation is necessary. In the private sector, we see a major capacity for internal investigation. We have good softwares that are out there. We have developed, and Valdir is involved. We have a school on the guarantees of the bureaucracy necessary to ensure the rights and ensure the legality of evidence that is produced, to have documentation that can be presented to the prosecutors, presented to courts, or to wherever.
Dentro desse universo, nós temos
And within that universe, we have always seen very good compliance programs growing. More than an obligation of the companies, it's the company's chance to get to know what may be going wrong internally and to use that information to decide what to do. And sometimes the path may be a good investigation, but as was already said here, it has to be a good investigation, consistent, well-defined, an investigation that's well done to generate credibility. And at the end of the day, it's important that the whole process have credibility and be as broad as possible in what it does.
Obrigado, Dr. Daiello.
Thank you, Dr. Daiello. Dr. Begonha, any final comments? I think that in Brazil, Valdir, we have taken a posture of collaboration with international efforts in fighting corporate crime. That stance in favor of cooperation shows that Brazil is part of an international community, an international virtual financial community, with sometimes the misconduct by a given company can have impacts on international markets. At that point,
E nos coloca numa perspectiva mundial. Eu vejo
threaten our presence in the international community. And since the late 1980s, our legislation is good and become better. Recently, we have an anti-corruption package of laws that has evolved further on money laundering to add new values to our law, not to create obstacles to fighting laundering. So our legal framework has a good state of the art that's recognized by authorities in Brazil.
a jurisprudência,
In terms of case law, both the Higher Court of Justice and the Supreme Court have reaffirmed time and again the investigatory powers and put value in giving credibility to the exchange of information that are powerful tools for fighting sophisticated crime. I also see as a false dilemma the tension expressed between international cooperation and the guarantee of fundamental rights. The idea that international cooperation inside Brazil should be carried out and interpreted pursuant to our legal framework and what's compatible with international agreements as well, including the specific agreement we have with the United States of America. From what we hear from our General Prosecutor's Office, our authorities have been very frank in their relations with the U.S. authorities. So I'm very optimistic, and I look with I have a positive outlook for these new frontiers being opened for Brazil. And this enhancement of our legislation, the gain in investigative and regulatory powers by the Brazilian agencies, all of them, greater exposure of companies to jurisdictions in other countries, such as the US, have meant that Brazilian companies are actually adopting in a quite genuine manner their own robust compliance programs. The best protection is prevention. These tools are not perfect, but they do act preventively to help fight crime and corruption, to promote integrity. We see Brazilian companies adopting the ESG agenda for social, environmental, and governance agendas with more respect for business partners, for their clients, their suppliers, more respect for their stockholders and the many different stakeholders. And that's great. And with the recognition of crime within a company, it's important that they investigate. As Dr. Perry said, it must be robust and broad, and share the information with authorities for possible collaboration. I'm certain that possible penalties after a good faith negotiation or bargaining will be attenuated. The company will go on with its work with less chances in the future of the practice of further crimes. That construction of business ethics is what we all desire. And beyond that, I'm very thankful for all of you for being here, Dr. Scanlon, Dr. Perry, Begonia, Leandro. It's been great to have you at this eerie event, to congratulate the Ministry of Defense and the Department of Justice and all of the prosecution authorities in Brazil that have been working to indoctrinate companies to move down the road of ethics and respect
Stakeholders.
for all stakeholders. This is essential to build a less distorted, more integrated, ethical business environment. I wish you all a good week, and thank you again for your participation. A warm embrace to our audience that always participates in our events. Thank you.
Thank you. Obrigado.
Abraço. Obrigado.
Muito
Thank you
obrigado.
very much.
Um abraço a todos.